The central claim of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. If he rose from the dead, then Christianity is true, because everything that he claimed has been confirmed. But if he didn't rise from the dead, Christianity is not true. So Christianity stands or falls on this event. Now, I don't think that there's anyone more qualified to make the case for the risen Jesus than our guest speaker here today, world-renowned New Testament scholar and Christian apologist, Dr. Mike Licona. Now, Dr. Licona is the president of the Risen Jesus Ministries. He's also the author of several fantastic books, including The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, and even the most recent, Raised on the Third Day, which actually just came out in November, so it's very new. So you definitely want to go and check out his stuff when we're finished here. And just one more thing, as this presentation goes on, if you think of questions, just drop those in the chat. And do us a favor and write in big capital letters questions so we can easily pick them out from the comments. And we'll try to get to them later. So now we're just going to go interview Dr. Mike Licona, who's going to make the case for the risen Jesus. So thanks for coming, Mike.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. Good to be with you guys.
I know I was watching one of your videos recently, and you talked about how when you did a big study of first century authors, that you came away with a lot about the way, I guess, the way the Gospels are written. Could you tell me what you found after studying through all that?
Whoa, there's a lot. So let's see if I can just do a broad look over here. So the way ancient history and biography was written is a little bit different than we write today, and we would be anachronistic if we just assumed that they wrote ancient biography and history like we write it today, that we operated by the same rules. That would be a fallacy called unbroken historical continuity. For example, we see something like that in the Middle Ages, Renaissance period, that is later on in the Renaissance period, when they're drawing pictures of, say, Jesus cleansing the temple, or, Jesus at the Last Supper or something like that. And he's wearing clothes like in the days of the Renaissance, right? So that's called unbroken historical continuity. It's like, okay, things exactly happened. People wore clothes and spoke and did things, same customs back in antiquity as they had in the days of the Renaissance. So that would be a fallacy, and it would be a similar fallacy to think that ancient historians and biographers operated by the same conventions as modern historians and biographers. Now, of course, there's a similarity. There's great similarity. In fact, there's a lot of similarity, more similarities than differences, but it's just not quite the same. So, for example, in modern biography, biographers are writing, trying to figure out, what shaped this person to become who they are. What are the psychological, let's do a psychoanalysis of this person to understand who they are and how they came to be this person. In antiquity, they had a little different view. They weren't interested in psychoanalysis because it wasn't a matter of a person's DNA or their upbringing or the cultural influences that made them who they were. In antiquity, they believed that a person was born with a certain character, and that more fully manifested itself as the person got older. But it's not that external influences would necessarily develop that within a person as we would believe today. So the objective of the modern biographer was simply to illuminate the character of the biography meaning the main character. That's spelled with an EE rather than Y at the end. So what's this person like? And so, as Plutarch says in the beginning of his life of Alexander the Great, that he's going to, not going to mention even the great deeds, because he says, this is a life. This is what they called biographies back then. This is a life, not a history. And so as a painter, would paint a portrait of someone and spend most time on the face and especially the eyes in order to capture who that person is in their countenance. So Plutarch says, so will I try to capture the essence of who this person is and illuminate who this is to you through their words and deeds. So they also allowed a little more flexibility in the way details were reported. So they weren't so much concerned with the precision that we are today. They wanted to be a good story. They were allowing some artistic liberties with the biographers, but that was limited. The best biographers and historians stayed very close to what the actual things happened, at least to the best of their ability. But they would play around with the details a little bit in order to bring out points more clearly, more powerfully, and to make for a better story. So that's just a few little things about the background of that cultural milieu and the literary conventions in play when the Gospels were written. And so we would anticipate that the Gospel authors are going to follow these literary conventions.
That's cool. Okay, so something that's asked quite often is like, okay, I wasn't there 2,000 years ago, so I don't know for sure that Jesus existed at all. So how can we truly know anything about the past? And how does that shape the search through history to this person, Jesus, who existed 2,000 years ago? And how can we know anything that he did for sure?
Well, that's a fair question. So what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And if we're going to say that about Jesus, we'd say that about any ancient figure, right? So how do we know Julius Caesar existed? How confident can we be that Julius Caesar existed? We talk about his crossing the Rubicon, but how do we know that he even existed? Well, you won't find a serious historian who would doubt the existence of Julius Caesar. Well, why not? Well, because we've got documents that talk about his deeds, right? It's hard to explain the rise of the, well, you've got the Roman Republic, but it's hard to explain the transition from republic to empire under Caesar's dictatorship as a tyrant, unless the stories about him are at least generally true about what's happened. That doesn't mean that every detail that's reported about Caesar's crossing the Rubicon or the things that led him to do so and the battles that took place afterward. So we're looking at general reliability. So you've got multiple independent sources. Do you have unsympathetic sources? Yeah, you got Cicero. You got Cicero mentioning Caesar. He didn't really like Caesar, but he's mentioning Caesar as a historical person. So you got all these kinds of things. Well, you can apply the same stuff to Jesus. You've got not only Christian accounts that claim to be eyewitnesses, like the Gospel of John. Matthew is attributed to Matthew, the lead, or one of the apostles, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. You've got Mark, Gospel of Mark, that said that he got most of his information. He's writing down what he heard Peter talk about. So you got these accounts from multiple independent sources. At least Mark and John should be considered independent. Then you got Paul. He mentions Jesus. In fact, he mentions that he knows Jesus's brother named James. Well, how do you know the brother of someone who never existed? And Paul says he was persecuting the church. And the church was, started by Jesus. And Paul would have been in Jerusalem celebrating the same feasts of Passover, etc., that was going on every year. He's a pious Jew. He would have been in Jerusalem the same time Jesus was. And so, he would have known whether the story about Jesus that the disciples were teaching about his teachings, his crucifixion, he would have known whether these things were true, if such a person existed. So, and you even have non-Christian sources who mention Jesus as well. Some of them are unsympathetic, even hostile. You have unsympathetic like Josephus, you have a hostile source like Tacitus and Lucian. They're hostile toward Jesus and the early Christians. So there aren't any serious historians today, professional historians, at least any that are highly respected, who question whether Jesus existed. I know that it's popular on the internet, but the only credential you need to publish on the internet is you have to breathe. Publishing on the World Wide Web, I've said before, does not make you a world-class scholar. Even Richard Carrier, who is a bona fide historian, a good education, educated or has a PhD in ancient history from Columbia University, an Ivy School. A few years ago, I don't know, a handful of years ago, he said, including himself, he knew of 7 bona fide scholars in the relevant fields who would say that Jesus did not exist. And none of them are highly regarded in their field, but only 7. Let me tell you, there are more credentialed scientists who embrace young earth creation, that the earth is no more than 15,000 years. There are more credentialed scientists who believe in a young earth creation than there are that think that professional historians who think that Jesus did not exist. So that's just a little bit. I've got a video on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and type in Mike Licona. And there's an interview I did with Mike Winger on whether Jesus existed, and just, search out, did Jesus exist? And I'm sure that'll come up. You can watch it.
Awesome. Okay, so the case for Jesus' existence is powerful then. If even these skeptical scholars are admitting that, okay, so this guy existed, so then what do we do then with the miraculous claims within Christianity? So we already made a case that miracles can happen if God exists, but let's just assume that, okay, we've not made any case for miracles. What do we do with these claims? Do these come out in, say, the skeptical or even anti-Christian historians, or is this only within the Gospels? Meaning that we're just supporting this by itself?
Well, you do have Josephus in a passage that is debated in his Histories of the Jews, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Section 63. And he mentions some things about Jesus. Now, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds is something that most specialists, Josephus specialists, would say Josephus mentions there about Jesus. There are some people who would say that the whole thing about Jesus and Josephus was a Christian interpolation, something that a Christian added in the 2nd or 3rd century. But by far, most Josephus scholars would reject that. They would think that Josephus does mention Jesus, but that the text we have has been doctored up a little bit. So it's a matter of debate over which parts were part of the original Josephus text and which were added by Christians. Most Josephus specialists do think that Josephus mentioned that Jesus was a worker of astonishing deeds. And the word that Josephus uses there for Jesus is not dunamis, for miracle or powerful. I think it's paradoxai, something the word just eludes me right now, but it means astonishing or amazing deeds. Josephus isn't necessarily saying that Jesus was a miracle worker, but that he performed deeds that astonished crowds, and that his followers and Jesus regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. And we have good reason to think that Jesus did perform such deeds. Again, I'm not arguing at this moment that they were actually truly miraculous or divine in nature, but because as a historian, we can't prove that. We can prove, for example, if you look at the claim, Jesus' death atones for sin. We, as a historian, could make a really strong case that Jesus died by crucifixion. We could also make a strong case that Jesus and or his disciples and early followers believed that his death atones for sin. But the historian wouldn't have any tool to determine whether Jesus' death actually atones for sin. I mean, what possible tool could a historian have to prove such a thing? Well, you can't. So that would be by faith. And it's the same thing when it comes to these miracles of Jesus. We can look, and we've got enough evidence. In fact, Graham Twelftree has shown that the miracles of Jesus are perhaps one of the strongest things attested that we can know about Jesus, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. But the historian has no tool in order to be able to determine if it were truly miraculous in nature or whether Jesus was a really good ancient magician, something like that. So, yeah.
Awesome. So what if we only had the Gospels? What if there was no extra biblical evidence, which there definitely is abundant? What if there's only the Gospels? Would we then be supporting, say, the gospel message by the gospel itself? Or are these actually pieces of evidence that sometimes get pushed aside as, oh no, these were biased Christians? So is this actual historical evidence, like documents that we can examine? Or is this something that we have to push aside from the beginning?
Well, sure. That's a good question. So let's take the Quran, for example. Okay. So, as a student of history, I could pick up a Quran, I could read it, and I don't believe that it's divinely inspired in any sense. I don't believe that when there's passages in there that say, lie in wait for the infidels or disbelievers, wait for them, ambush and kill them. I don't believe that God ever commanded, gave that message to Muhammad. But as a student of history, I can conclude that Muhammad commanded his followers to lie in ambush, lie in wait and ambush the non-believers and ambush and kill them. When I read a surah where Allah says to Jesus, did you tell your followers that you, me, and Mary are gods? And Jesus responds, no, I never said such a thing. I only said worship God and we're his servants. We're his servants. So as a student of history, I can't determine. I don't think God actually said that, nor that conversation between God and Jesus. As a student of history, I can't determine that one way or the other. However, I could take that text and say, well, Muslims in the 7th century were believing that the Christians were saying that Jesus, Mary, and God that was part of a Trinity. In other words, there was a misunderstanding of what the Christians were actually claiming, and they saw maybe a Catholic view or an Orthodox Greek view or something of their high view of Jesus, and confused that for those Christians to be saying that Mary is part of a Trinity, right? So I can look at the document through historical eyes, the Quran, and I can learn certain things. Well, historians of Jesus do the same thing. They don't presuppose the Bible is divinely inspired. They don't even have to presuppose it's generally reliable in any sense. And still, there are things that they can learn from these documents. I mean, it's beyond question that the early Christians were claiming that Jesus died for our sins and that he rose from the dead. I mean, that's beyond dispute. We have proof of that. You've got early manuscripts that have this. So we know that the early Christians were claiming these things. The thing as historians we have to ask is what led them to claim these things, and did they really believe it? So that leads to other questions that historians try to tackle.
Awesome. Okay, so we've moved that, and we've seen that Jesus was indeed a historical figure, and that the documents, both gospels and then extra biblical sources, confirm that, okay, this guy's real and there is something special about him. So moving on to his death and resurrection, what is the specific evidence? Like, what can we point to that, okay, he died, he's put in a tomb, and then something happened. He was never found physically. That tomb was empty. And there are all these post-mortem appearances.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. And of course, there's quite a bit of evidence. Let me just narrow it down and give you what I think would be the one piece that is the strongest. Okay. So there's others, but I'll just give you the one thing that I think is the strongest. In our New Testaments, there are 27 books and letters, okay, that form our New Testament. 13 of the 27 pieces of literature in our New Testament are attributed to the Apostle Paul, okay? And of those 13, scholars dispute 6 of them on whether Paul actually wrote them, whereas 7 of them are undisputed. Virtually 100% of even skeptical scholars acknowledge that Paul wrote 7 of those letters. Of the remaining 6, there are probably 2 of them that are the majority of scholars think Paul wrote, but it's not unanimous. And then that leaves 4 that are hotly disputed, okay? So let's just to make it simple, let's just take I'll take from the 7 letters that are undisputedly written by Paul and what we can learn from that, okay? There's plenty we can learn, but let me just focus on a couple of things. Number 1, there was a guy named Paul who persecuted the church. He believed that Jesus was a false prophet and a failed Messiah, and he wanted to help destroy this, what he believed was a harmful cult comprised of early Jews called Christians, okay? Or they were called Christians, later on, but they called themselves the Way. They were followers of Jesus and so forth. So Paul's out, and all of a sudden, Jesus appears to him. At least let's say it this way. Paul has an experience that he interprets as the risen Jesus appearing to him. That's undisputed amongst even skeptical scholars who study the stuff today. He has an experience that he interprets as the risen Jesus appearing to him, and it radically transforms his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Okay. Now, 3 years after that experience, Paul says in one of his undisputed letters, Galatians chapter 1, that he goes up to Jerusalem and he visits the apostles. He saw Peter, the lead apostle, and then he also saw James, the brother of Jesus, he says, the brother of the Lord. So you got Peter and James, and he spent 15 days with Peter. And the Greek term that's used there for meeting with, spending time with, is historicity, from which, of course, we get the English term history. So he's getting an accounting from Peter of what Jesus did while he was there. Paul had, probably heard, there's a good chance that Paul heard Jesus teach, but he had limited exposure to Jesus and he wanted to learn more. He wanted to get the whole 9 yards. And so who better than to get it from Jesus' lead apostle and one of Jesus's 3 closest disciples, Peter. And then in chapter 2 of Galatians, he says 14 years later, he goes back up to Jerusalem, and this time he meets with the pillars. He calls them the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John. So it's a second time meeting with Peter, a second time seeing James, and now the first time seeing John. These are the pillars of the church. And Paul says he ran the gospel message past them he had been preaching to ensure that he was on message with what they were preaching. And Paul says they added nothing to his message. In other words, they're saying, great job, Paul. Keep up the good work, brother. Now, of course, Paul could have been lying here, right? So we look for corroborating evidence, and we find this. We find this in 2 ancient authors, one named Polycarp, the other named Clement of Rome. Polycarp is believed to have been a disciple of the Apostle John, and Clement of Rome is believed to have been a disciple of the Apostle Peter. So who better to hear from than these two, who would have been 2 of the 3 pillars? Now, they don't mention the specific meaning, and both of them are writing after Paul has died. So they're not worried about any repercussions if they say that Paul lied about this. They speak with very laudatory terms of Paul. Clement of Rome calls him the blessed Paul and places Paul on par with his mentor Peter. Polycarp quotes from Paul's letter to the Ephesians and refers to it as part of the sacred scriptures. Well, if Paul was a heretic or preaching differently than Peter and the other apostles, we wouldn't expect for Clement to refer to Polycarp to refer to Paul's letters as sacred scriptures. And then Polycarp goes on to say that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. Again, this is exactly what you would expect to see if Paul was telling the truth. So when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, he gives the gospel message. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. Of course, he would receive this from the Jerusalem leadership. And then he goes and he talks about the death, burial, resurrection, and the appearances of Jesus, post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And he says, in verse 11, whether I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believe. This is just amazing stuff. Historians look at this. In fact, I think it was Gert Ludemann, who is an atheist New Testament scholar, saying this is one of the greatest, focusing on this oral tradition that I've just mentioned. It's one of the greatest things that we've learned from New Testament studies over the past century. So it's like historical gold, because through Paul, even if we didn't have the Gospels, through Paul, we could get back to a basic outline of what Jesus' disciples who had walked with him, what the other apostles were preaching. So through Paul, when we read Paul on at least the gospel message, it's not to say that he's preaching everything the same thing as the Jerusalem apostles, but when we read Paul on the gospel message, we can know that we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. And that's just amazing. It really is. To think about this. We are hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles, certifiably the official and formal public proclamation of Jesus' disciples on Jesus. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So is it safe to say that as historians, we kind of reason from effect to cause, that here's this unlikely ally, the Apostle Paul, who would not have had this outrageous conversion to Christianity if there was not incredible evidence, if there was not an appearance of Jesus himself to the Apostle Paul?
Well, I think it would be safe to conclude, Ash, that Paul wouldn't have converted. I mean, he's out persecuting Christians. He thinks Jesus is a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the world Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. And he wasn't grieving over Jesus' death, of course. He was glad Jesus was now gone. So I think we could say that Paul would not have converted unless he had had an experience that led him to think and believe that Jesus had appeared to him. So then we got to look and say, you take other things. Well, if the apostles are saying that he appeared to them as well, and when you read that oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, you got multiple appearances to individuals, multiple appearances to groups. And you got to say, well, what led them? What's the nature of these appearances? What led them to the belief that Jesus had been raised and had appeared to them? And as Dale Allison at Princeton has said, the answer to that question is the prize puzzle of New Testament research.
That's awesome. Okay. Arthur, do you have any further questions?
Yeah, I do. So firstly, I was just gonna ask if someone were to go to you, and then imagine they just heard everything you said, but that they were unsatisfied because they like scientific evidence. Could you explain the difference between evidences in different fields? Why you don't look at evidence all the same?
Sure. I mean, if a person is looking for scientific evidence that Jesus rose, then they're using the wrong tool. It's like taking your laptop and taking it in for an MRI to determine why it's running slowly, or you can't measure love in a test tube. You wouldn't look through the Hubble Space Telescope to find out what was going on in ancient Rome. It's just science is the wrong tool. Science, and it depends what branch of science you're looking at. In astronomy, you don't use test tubes. In biology, you don't use telescopes. In geology, you use totally different tools. So what kind of tools? If you're looking for controlled and repeatable experiments, you can't do that in all sciences. What do you do in cosmology? Not cosmetology, but cosmology, the study of the origin of our universe. What do you do with you don't have you can't do controlled and repeatable experiments when it comes to the Big Bang, right? Because that is alleged to be a singular event, that it only happened once. We know through science that is the case. It only happened once. So, what science? They're all different tests. So when it comes to history is like a soft science. It's more like biology or geology in this kind of sense. It's like archaeology. So like archaeology, you would, take the ashes, the stones that remain, and you try to piece them together in order to make sense of what happened. That combined with histories and accounts that were written about the past, in the past, you would look at all those things to find out what happened. And you would do the same thing with Jesus and the resurrection. So it is more of a soft science, but it is a science. You can't do controlled and repeatable experiments when it comes to historical investigation. How would you do that? Like with Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, right? Well, you can't do a controlled and repeatable experiment there. History is history. You've got these events and you've got to examine the evidence for it, formulate hypotheses, and see which hypothesis best explains the facts. And the one that accounts for the facts better than competing hypotheses, historians regard that as what probably occurred.
Okay, yeah, awesome. And then the other thing I was going to ask is, when you look at the manuscripts of just ancient literature, so maybe like Homer or like these other people that you're citing, how does that compare with the manuscripts of, let's say, letters of Paul or the Gospels? Is there a difference between ancient manuscripts of the Bible and ancient manuscripts of other things?
That's a good question, Arthur. Now, I'm not sure which one you're asking. Maybe you're asking two different things here. Are you asking about the manuscripts themselves? Or are you talking about the events reported in the manuscripts? Like, yeah.
I guess can you do both?
I was afraid you did say that.
Yeah, so what I meant originally was just basically copies of certain things, but
Okay.
it seems like there's another thing also that you want to talk about.
Yeah, well, we can do both. We'll see if we can do both. So in terms of the manuscripts, let me just say this first of all, that even Bart Ehrman, who on some days he's an agnostic, some days he's an atheist. Bart's a friend of mine, smart guy, teaches New Testament at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Okay. Very popular, skeptical speaker. In fact, he may be the most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in North America. He calls into question everything, and atheists and Muslims just love him. Jesus mythers who don't think Jesus ever existed, they don't love him because he thinks they're crazy. He says that's just a crazy position to hold, that Jesus never existed. But most atheists and Muslims and non-believers love Bart Ehrman because he does his best to call into question the reliability of the Gospels. That said, Ehrman himself, who is one of the leading experts in the world on the manuscripts of the New Testament and of the Gospels, he'll say that the manuscript evidence we have for our New Testament is superior to any other piece of ancient literature by far. So that's what he acknowledges, okay? So that's one thing, and you can see why. We've got over 5,000 Greek manuscripts. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. Over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, they're not all total, complete manuscripts. Some of them are just fragments the size of a credit card. And some of them are, but the average manuscript is over 400 pages long. All right, that's the average size of a New Testament manuscript that we have. Of all these 5,000, you've got 600 of them that are under 1,000 years old. Okay. And you've got somewhere between 10 and 15 or 16 manuscripts that are less than 150 years, written 150 years of the autographs. Now, when you compare that with ancient manuscripts of, let's say, the ancient Roman Latin literature. Okay, I got a book on my shelf. Let me grab it. I'll show it to you. All right, this is called Text and Transmission, edited by L.D. Reynolds. Okay, let's see if we can get, there we go. It's published by Oxford University Press. If anyone wants it, I think they sell it for $400. Serious. I mean, these kind of academic books are really expensive. Anyway, in here, you go through it and it lists all the Latin literature in antiquity. And I counted one day, I think I counted 99 different authors. And of course, many of those authors wrote several pieces of literature. Like Suetonius wrote his 12 Caesars, 12 different biographies. And then he wrote biographies of other people as well. So, I mean, that's just one author. So you got all these things. And here's what it says here in, this is in the introduction. He says, the present volume with its list of some 1,700 manuscripts is no substitute for a complete catalog, but it does offer something else. The manuscripts which we mention are, by and large, those on which our critical texts are based. They are the bones and sinews of the classical tradition. Their distribution over the centuries may therefore be of some interest, and then it divides them up, and they're divided between the 9th and 15th century. So in other words, let me just summarize. You got 99 different authors, and between those 99 authors and everything that each of those authors wrote, we only have 1,700 manuscripts that scholars use to form their critical Latin text, and those manuscripts are dated largely between the 9th and 15th centuries. Cicero wrote in the 1st century BC. Caesar wrote in the 1st century BC. Tacitus wrote in the early 2nd century. And I think the earliest manuscript, we only have one manuscript of Tacitus, and it's 11th century. So, I mean, that's what we have with some of these. And Tacitus is regarded as our greatest Roman historian. So you can see that what we have now with the Greek New Testament, even though we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts, they only use maybe 400, 500 of those for our critical Greek New Testaments. But still, I mean, you've got at least 9 authors in the New Testament, at least 9, but 400 or 500 manuscripts, for all their writings, compared to 1,700 for 99. And ours are far better in terms of, they're closer to the event. So, that's why Bart Ehrman would say that the text of the New Testament we have is better than what we have for any other ancient literature. So if a person wants to say, well, you got these, you'll hear skeptics say, well, we don't have the autographs. We only have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. Well, guess what, buddy? You got worse than that for all the other ancient literature. So if you don't like it for the New Testament, you better write to all the universities across the world in their classics department and tell them that they ought to close doors, because we can't trust anything that these guys say. We can't even believe that, trust that what we have today is what was close to what was written. And of course, no one's going to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's overwhelming right there.
Okay, so this question kind of entails, kind of as like a summarization of everything you've been explaining. So what would you say to someone who says, okay, so resurrection, that's a pretty extreme claim. Does that require an extreme amount of evidence? How can we assume a resurrection? And are we reasonable in assuming that based on the evidence, or are we kind of crazy?
Well, let's talk about this thing. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This was a watchword of the late Carl Sagan, an atheist astronomer. But do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? That's an interesting question. So let me posit a hypothetical scenario to you. Let's say that I'm doing a lecture somewhere, and you all are sitting in the audience. Everyone here, everyone watching is sitting in the audience, watching live, not by Zoom, but you're right there in the audience. And as I'm talking, some Muslim terrorists come into the auditorium, and they come up and they say, Lacona, you've debated Muslims and you've said that Islam is a false religion. You said because Christianity is true, you've got to die. And they lop off my head on stage while everybody is an eyewitness and watches. And then they see some people calling the police, and so they flee, leaving my headless corpse on the stage. Now, an hour later, all of you are outside of the auditorium talking to police officers. You're talking to the press. They're recording your eyewitness testimony. And then I come walking out of the auditorium. My head's attached. I'm alive and well. You see a scar around my neck. Doctors look at me and it's, whoa. And let's just say they came up on stage while I was there and they saw and they confirmed I was dead. Now they're confirming that I'm alive. And I come back and I say, hey, Ash, guess what? Well, I was in heaven. God has resurrected me and brought me back, just resuscitated like he did with Lazarus. He's brought me back to testify again that Jesus is Lord, and you need to repent and believe. And by the way, when I was in heaven, I saw your grandmom who died 10 years ago, let's say, in a car, or she had a stroke. She was in the hospital and you went to see her and she whispered something in your ear moments before she died, and you never shared it with anyone. And she shared it with me. And I'm going to share it with you to prove that I actually spoke with her. And it's just what she told you. And I mean, how can that happen, right? I mean, that's definitely a miracle. It's an extraordinary event. And you guys have all seen it. You've been eyewitnesses to it. Now, does it require extraordinary evidence for you to believe? It was an extraordinary event, but does it require extraordinary evidence? No. You had a doctor that certified I was dead. You had another doctor certify that I was alive. You had the evidence that I reported what your grandmother told you right before she died. That's not extraordinary by any means. You were an eyewitness. All of you were eyewitnesses who were in the auditorium. That's not extraordinary. That's ordinary. People are eyewitnesses to events all the time. It's just you were you have ordinary witnesses, ordinary evidence that testified to an extraordinary event. And you're certainly justified in believing it based on ordinary evidence. It's just the evidence should be good. And I think we do have that for the resurrection.
Awesome. Okay, so now if any of you in the audience have any questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat and we'll get to those. So while you're doing that, I have two questions, more just like advice. So first, what are two book recommendations? If you would give everyone in the audience two book recommendations, what would you say? Two must reads.
If you're looking what for resurrection or Christian apologetics, God's existence for what?
Yeah, let's say resurrection.
Well, it depends how much detail you want to get into. If you just want to do a self-study course to give you a basic idea, a pretty good idea of the evidence for the resurrection, Gary Habermas and I wrote a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus that was published in 2004. And that book is pretty much a self-study course that helps you learn the basic evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and addresses some of the more popular objections to the resurrection. If you really want to get into it in depth with it, then I would recommend my book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. And it's not a light read. I mean, it is readable, but it's not something that, if you're not used to reading academic stuff or heavier, because it's like 700 pages. Okay. So, but if you really want to get into it, heavy and deep into this thing and look at pretty much all the objections and get extensive evidence, then I'd say that be the book for you. In fact, Gary Habermas, he is the leading expert in the world on the resurrection. And he said my big book on the resurrection, in his opinion, is the best ever written on the topic.
That's awesome. Okay, well, looks like the audience is still shy. Come on, drop your questions. Okay, so the other question would be, what would be your advice yourself back when you had just started to make the case for Christianity, for the resurrection of Christ? What advice would you give yourself?
I do think about this at times. God willing, I'll turn 60 in July. And I look back and say, what if I were a college age student? What if I was 20 years old? What would I say to myself as a 20-year-old? Because you learn things through life, and, you get out of college and you've got all these hopes and dreams at you. And for most people, life doesn't turn out exactly how they thought it was going to or hoped it was going to. And they thought that, once they got going, man, life was they're just going to keep getting, bigger, more things coming into their life and more success or whatever. And it doesn't usually happen that way. Things are slow, but then all of a sudden, you've had kids and now they're grown and gone, and you're 60 years old and you're looking back and saying, wow, my parents said that time really goes by fast once you get grown up, and it really does. It doesn't seem like it's going fast while it's going, but you look back and it's like, whoa, it really does go by fast. So I look back and say, okay, wow, if I had to go back to age 20, one thing I would do is I'd be really continuing to focus on my relationship with the Lord. Now, I was very focused on my relationship with the Lord back then, but I would continue to do that and always make that number one in my life. And I'd trust him, for more things. I wouldn't be so anxious about things, because now I look back into things that I was anxious over, like, being heartbroken over a relationship with a girl that broke up with me. I look over that now and say, well, God does work stuff out, and he's got a plan for you. Not all of it may be good, because he's got his own plans, and the number one thing is his kingdom, not our happiness. It's his kingdom and our holiness. So, but we submit to him, and you start to realize that this life is pretty brief. It really is relatively brief. So let's really commit ourselves to the Lord. So that would be my life, how I would look at things more. In terms of resurrection, I'd be saying, read everything you can on it. If you really want to become proficient on it, you got to spend time. You hear it say, if you want to be an expert at something, you got to spend 10,000 hours at least. Until you spend 10,000 hours, you can't consider yourself an expert. So, you have to spend 10,000 hours playing a musical instrument before you become proficient, really proficient in it. You got to spend time. So if you really want to master the information on the resurrection of Jesus, you got to spend time. You got to read. I've spent way over 10,000 hours on it. That's a cool thing. You'll never be able to exhaust the things for the resurrection. I'll tell you why. Gary Habermas has been, assembling a bibliography of everything written by scholars on the resurrection since 1975. And that's well over, I think, 5,000 now. And it comes to just less than 100 journal articles and books written every year on the resurrection. You'll never be able to read all of those just on the resurrection, but there's a lot to read. So if you really want to become proficient in it, you just got to read a whole lot, study it.
That's awesome, man. That's crazy. I didn't know there was that much. Wow. Okay, awesome. Arthur, do you want to go ahead and read all the questions in the chat?
Yeah. So Avery asked, what is the best evidence against the claim that the disciples stole the body?
Well, the best evidence against the claim that they stole the body is to show that they actually believed that Jesus rose and had appeared to them. And that evidence would be their continued willingness to suffer for their gospel proclamation, which included the resurrection. Their continuing willingness to suffer for their proclamation and willingness even to die for that. And we know that several of them did die as Christian martyrs. For example, Peter, we know James, the brother of Jesus, did. And Paul, we know that he did. He died as a martyr. He was beheaded. Peter was crucified, and James was killed James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned, thrown off the pinnacle of the temple and then stoned. Liars make poor martyrs. And even though we can't prove that all of them died the death of a martyr, when you start to see your colleagues who are out proclaiming the same message and they're being arrested and executed, and you go out after their execution and you're proclaiming the same message, well, that shows your willingness to suffer the same fate. So whether you are martyred or killed as a result of your gospel proclamation, you're willing to be. And liars make poor martyrs. Now, maybe you say, well, yeah, but Muslim jihadists are willing to die for their cause. That's right. And it's because they believe their cause is true. That you don't have a Muslim going in to other terrorists and saying, how can I serve Islam? And they say, well, strap this bomb on your back and go blow up these people. And they walk away and they think, okay, well, if I do that, let's see, the Quran is not of God. Muhammad was a false prophet. And if I kill all these people, I may go to hell. Sign me up. No, that's not what's going on. They're thinking Islam is a true religion. I want to die for Islam. And I'm going to do this because they believe Islam is true. That's why they do it. The disciples proclaimed the death, burial, resurrection, and the message of Jesus to their own persecution and threats of deaths, and even in some cases their deaths. And they all suffered horribly, though, for their gospel proclamation. They did this because they believed it was true. But there is a difference between Muslim jihadists and the apostles. You see, Muslim jihadists are dying. They believe it's true based on the testimony of the Quran. But for all they know, it may not be true. Same thing with Christians who die as martyrs today. They die based on the testimony of what we find in Scripture, in our Bibles. But for all they know, it may not be true. The apostles, on the other hand, died knowing that either Jesus rose or he didn't rise. They either were dying for a known lie or they were dying for what they knew to be true. And again, liars make poor martyrs. You might have one or two of them die for what they know is a lie, but all of them being willing to die for a known lie, not going to happen. So this shows that the disciples more than claimed that Jesus rose, they actually believed it. They weren't lying. They didn't steal the body.
That's awesome. So Seth asked, do Christians have a different view on death than non-Christians?
Well, sure. When you say non-Christians, are you referring to atheists, to Muslims, to Buddhists?
I guess he would mean everyone else. And
well,
that's kind of rough, huh? Okay,
yeah.
let's go Islam, atheists, and then
Okay, so Islam, they believe in a heaven and a hell. So you could say in that sense that we believe in a kind of afterlife too. Maybe a difference there would be, though, Muslims, at least my understanding, Islam teaches that hell is this like inferno and torture chamber where people, like it describes it, boiling water will be poured on the damned, and then God will give them new skin so that boiling water can be thrown on them, poured on them again. And it just happens like that throughout all eternity. It's terrible. It's like a divine torture chamber. Christians are divided on this. Is there a literal hell where there's flames and maggots and things like that? Most theologians today say that hell is a real place where, hell is a real place, but they don't interpret the flames as actual flames. They interpret it as metaphors for judgment. So hell would be a terrible place. You don't want to go there, but it's where you are quarantined away from God's presence forever. And then there are some theologians, many, who interpret hell as it's annihilation. You may suffer in hell for a little bit, but then you are finally annihilated. So you don't suffer conscious torment forever, but your punishment is an eternal punishment. It's kind of like the death penalty, you could say, is an eternal punishment because we are banishing you forever from life on earth when they execute you. Okay. So in the same way, you could say annihilation is you are being banished from God's presence of joy and peace and happiness forever. You're going to be away from his presence forever. So either way, it's a horrible thought. But that would be difference between, say, Islam and Christianity. Buddhism, of course, and Buddhism has different sects within it. But Buddhism and Islam, a lot of what they believe is in reincarnation. So you'll have many chances to get this thing right and to become perfected. And then atheism, of course, they just believe that pretty much that when you die, that's it. There is no soul. You die, you cease to exist, and your body is all that there is, no soul, no spirit, and you die, you just cease to exist, and your body decomposes, and you're just eventually forgotten. And in fact, in that case, in the distant future, our universe is going to burn out. All the stars will burn out, and there's just going to be one endless cosmic night, one cold, dark universe where everything just stops. And it just is that way forever then. And no one is left to be alive or remember anything. So in that case, life is just ultimately, it's meaningless.
Okay. So Dan asked, what would you say to someone who is skeptical about the resurrection as they claim there are inconsistencies with the accounts? So it seems like he's talking about the Gospels. For example, different women groupings going to the tomb.
Yeah, good question. Now, I wrote a book on that. In fact, not just on the resurrection, but on the Gospels. I did an 8-year study in 2017. This book was published by Oxford University Press. Why are there differences in the Gospels? And so I deal with that. So let me just say a couple of things. The differences between the gospel accounts, whether it's the resurrection or on Jesus' miracles or stories about Jesus, they don't disagree to any more extent than what we find in the ancient literature when they're reporting multiple accounts reporting the same story. The assassination of Julius Caesar, we mentioned him crossing the Rubicon, but the assassination of Julius Caesar is mentioned by several ancient authors. In fact, Plutarch himself mentions it 4 times in 4 of his biographies. He mentions it in his biography of Cicero, Caesar, Brutus, and Antony. And you've got conflicting details, the same kind of extent of conflicts, discrepancies between the details as we find in the Gospels. A lot of it has to do with the compositional devices that were part and parcel of writing ancient history, things that they just allowed ancient authors to do. And so we shouldn't be like today, we abbreviate things, or maybe, I mention to someone tomorrow, well, someone says, what'd you do last night? Well, I spoke to this group, Generation Zion, and I was talking to a guy named Arthur was asking me questions. Well, maybe I don't mention Ash. That doesn't mean that Ash wasn't there, but I was just focusing on you. I'm like shining my spotlight on Arthur because you were the one that contacted me via email to set this up, right? So that's not a contradiction. If I mention Arthur here, and then in an email to someone else, I mentioned Arthur and Ash. And then in another email, I mentioned, hey, there were some people who joined us online and asked questions. That's not a contradiction. So a lot of the things in the Gospels can be explained in that sort of sense. There's these compositional devices. And I would say this too, and look, I wrote a whole book on it. I can't get into the whole thing, but even if we couldn't address some of these, and there are some differences between the resurrection narratives that I can answer. I think there's 3 of them that I really just don't know the answer. Most of them I do. I can explain, but like the thing with the women coming to the tomb, you've got the biggest one is John only mentions Mary Magdalene, whereas the other Gospels mention multiple women. John says early in the morning while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, found it empty, came back and said, they've taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him. Well, who's we? She must be referring to the other women there. So there's all kinds of things that we can do to explain these things. But at worst, even if you had a couple of contradictions, it doesn't mean that the general story is false. And you had eyewitnesses who survived the Titanic sinking a little over 100 years ago. Eyewitnesses. Some of them said the ship broke in 2 before it sank. Others said, no, it went down intact. They contradicted one another, but no one turned around and said, well, I guess the Titanic didn't sink. Or I can't believe anything these eyewitnesses are saying. No, they just said, hey, they got some of these details wrong. So we do the same thing with the Gospels. We do the same thing with the assassination of Caesar or any of these other things.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Seth asked a really big one. He said, if God loves everyone, why does he send people to hell?
Seth, that's a good question. I don't understand everything, to be honest with you. It troubles me to think about people going to hell. Now, one, I think it is helpful to know that hell may not be this divine torture chamber that, this picture we get in our mind of people being tormented in flames. And I think one reason to think that it's not that is look at Luke 16. You've got the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and Lazarus has died. He's up with Abraham, and in paradise, and then you've got the rich man in hell. And he said, Abraham, please send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I'm tormented in this flame. Well, if I'm tormented in a flame, I'm going to be asking for more than just a drop of water, right? That's one thing. Another thing is, I'm sure all of your viewers right now, they have at some time been burned by fire, maybe just a match under the finger, or they accidentally put their hand on the stove and they pulled it off quickly, or they touched their mom's iron and pulled it off, and they got a blister just from that moment. You're not going to be able to speak in a coherent manner if you got a flame that's burning you. This guy says he's being tormented in a flame and he's speaking incoherent. Oh, please send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water. Oh, please send Lazarus to my brothers to tell them to avoid this place. This metaphorical stuff. So I think it's hell's a real place. People are there with regret, but it's not this torture chamber. So that's one thing to think of. Another thing is, we really don't know the nature of hell. It's quarantine away from God's presence, and the way Jesus speaks, we're to avoid it at all costs. But a lot of people, if they have heard the gospel and they just reject it, and a lot of atheists today, it's like, well, if God sends people to hell, he can send me there because I don't want to worship him. Okay, if that's what you want, look, if God really did send people to an eternal torture chamber, I may not like that God, but I'm going to fear him and I'm going to worship him because I have my own self-interest in view. And so, in a sense, you could say that God, as C.S. Lewis said, there will be those on the judgment day. Some people will say, God will say to some people will have said, it's like, thy will be done. People said to God, thy will be done, and he welcomes them. Others, God will say to them, thy will be done. You didn't want anything to do with me during this life, and so you don't want to be with me. I'm not going to force you to be with me. So he quarantines them forever away from his presence. So I don't understand the whole thing about eternal damnation. Some of it honestly bothers me, but I don't get to make the rules. I didn't create the universe. I don't run the universe. I don't understand everything about God. I do believe, though, that he is a loving, merciful God, and he's not going to just send people to hell for no reason. He's not going to send them to hell because they didn't accept him if they never heard about him. He's going to judge them according to what they did with the knowledge they received.
Yeah, it's a very heavy issue, and we can talk about that more after. One other thing that Seth asked, he said, why does God let bad things happen?
That's a good question too. So if we are going to believe the Bible in this, the Genesis account talks about sin entering in the world, and because sin entered our world, there were consequences, moral consequences and natural consequences. The nature of the world changed. And now we had things like tornadoes and tsunamis and hurricanes and famines, things like that. You've got evil people. So let's just talk about the evil people here for a moment, because that probably is more bothersome. Why didn't God cause Adolf Hitler to miscarry? Why does he allow such evil people to do evil things to others? We don't know exactly. What we do know is God looks at all the different scenarios, and he may allow certain things to avoid even worse things in the future. Like, how do we know that, maybe if God had caused Adolf Hitler to be a miscarriage, that maybe 50 years later, someone else would come along after the atomic bomb had been invented, and they would have gotten a hold of that and the new Nazi kind of people would have won the war, and we'd all be under Nazi regime now. Maybe the fact is he allowed Hitler to be at that time, so that he allowed the atrocities so that, the world would not allow such a thing to happen again. It's possible. I mean, we can only guess at these kinds of things. Another thing we could say is evil happens from people in the world today because God gives them free will. You say, well, maybe he shouldn't give us free will. Okay. So let's just say this. God puts a box in front of you and says, hey, there's a red button here. If you push that red button, you will never experience any evil again. No pain or suffering. Okay. All you have to do is push that red button. But if you do that, you have no free will. You will only do what I program you to do. You'll have no real feelings or free will about it. You'll just be like a robot. You'll do what I programmed you to do. Would you push that button? And a lot of people say no, they wouldn't, because they value the free will, and they're willing to take the evil, pain, and suffering that goes with that. They would rather have that than to have their free will and individuality taken away from them. So you've heard it said, there's a Proverbs that says there's no milk without manure. And with free will comes evil, pain, and suffering from other individuals. But Jesus has taken care of the ultimate penalty for and ultimate problems. And he's going to redeem the world. And he has redeemed us on the cross, and will give us eternal life away from evil, and will dry every tear in the future.
All right, that's awesome. So this last one that Seth had, he said, if God told you to kill someone, would that be considered a sin?
Well, if God told me to kill, let's say God tells Dietrich Bonhoeffer to kill Adolf Hitler, is that a sin? No, I think if God tells someone to do it, it would not be sin. It's like when God tells the Israelites to go and to wipe out these evil people that are sacrificing their own babies, burning them alive to these pagan gods. I think that's okay to obey God on that. Now, I don't ever expect that God is going to tell me to kill someone. Just get up and kill someone. He's, because that's outside of the character of God. When I read that in scripture about God, he's not going to tell me to do that.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of like a classic question that someone had. It's like, is something good because God commands it?
Yeah.
Or it basically sets up a false dichotomy. But if God commanded you to do something and it seemed morally wrong, the way I think is like, if like, to me, God is goodness, like he is the standard of goodness. So to me, like, if he commanded that, it wouldn't be in this universe, because if it did end up being morally wrong, it wouldn't be the God that I worship. So that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, he's not going to command me to go commit adultery.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All right, awesome.
Goodness is bound up in the character of God.
Yeah, I feel like one other thing that we could look at it for that question is, so if God commands you to take a life, is he really killing someone? Like if God kills someone, is he taking a life? Really, I think it's Frank Turk who says it, that God doesn't kill anybody. At most, he just transports people from this life to the next life. He's not taking something away from anybody. Ultimately, he's the giver of life, and he just moves people from one place to another.
That's correct. Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah. All right, well, we have one more question before we let you go, as we move on to our praise time after that. But so where can this group find you? If they want to know more about what you teach, what stuff you have, your books, where can they find you?
Well, you can go to, book outlets, Amazon, christianbook.com. Just put my name in there, Michael Licona. You'll see the books I've written. You can go to my website, risenjesus.com. You can go to my YouTube channel. Just type in Mike Licona, Licona at YouTube, and my channel will come up. We've got a lot of educational videos on there. You can watch debates, in which I've had as well, debates, lectures, interviews that I've done with experts on the subject, like the formation of the biblical canon and all kinds of really cool stuff. So that's something. Someone's interested in earning a degree in apologetics. I teach at Houston Baptist University, hbu.edu. We are going to be offering a minor, so you can have a minor in Christian apologetics. And we also have a master's degree program in Christian apologetics. Honestly, I think it's the finest in the world right now. There's some other good ones out there, but I do think ours is the finest in the world. And they can do it on campus at HBU, or they can do the entire thing online at HBU. And I think you can do a minor in Christian apologetics online entirely. At least you will be in the near future, because that minor, I think, may be coming out in the fall. So yeah, so that's some ways that they can learn about some of our materials.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming once again. It's been great having you on.
Yeah, my pleasure. God bless you guys.
Good
Thanks,
night.
you too. Good night.
Bye.